Thank you for joining the Dream Job Podcast. I'm Mark Took, and a bit of a departure today, talking about an issue that is really important to me, and I know a lot of people, and that is public education. Joining us is a man who has spent time in the classroom as a teacher. Now he's back in the classroom as a student, getting his doctorate from the University of Texas, where his dissertation is on the topic of state takeovers of local school districts, specifically Houston ISD. Dan Dawer, appreciate you sharing your insight and expertise with me today. And I'm curious on your pathway from being in the classroom to getting a PhD to focusing on this topic, how you ended up here.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and excited to be here. So I started teaching, I entered the classroom in 2010, teaching middle school in Texas in a public school. I taught for 11 years. My last year in the classroom was the 21-22 school year. Over that time, I taught middle and high school English language arts. I coordinated a college readiness program called Abbott, but I was on sort of the receiving end of a lot of state level policy in education. During that time, there were shifts made at the state level related to the state's accountability policy that were pretty significant. So between 2010 and 2022, we switched to a new state test, to the STAR test. The state beefed up the sanctions applied to campuses and to districts that failed to show sufficient performance. And as a result of that, the culture on my school campus changed pretty significantly. When I first started teaching, we knew that there was going to be a standardized test at the end of the year. Our goal was still to prepare students for it, but really our focus and instruction was, are we preparing students for these standards, right? So we built curriculum around the standards, knowing that the test was coming. As the test approached, we talked to students to say, hey, here's the format of the test. Here's what to expect, how to pace yourself. Here are some test-taking strategies. Fast forward to the end of my teaching career, the focus from beginning to end was on the test, right? So lessons were created and handed down by the district. They looked very much like the test. And that intensification of accountability policy is really what drove me to want to do this research, to step outside the classroom and try to understand, at a system level, how is accountability policy in Texas restructuring the experience of teaching and learning across the state?
It's a lot there that got you to this point. How would you describe your kind of overall opinion about the role of public schools and a public school education, in Texas, in America, and society at large?
Yeah, public education, at the risk of sounding cliche, is the cornerstone of democracy, right? It's one of the few public institutions we have left in our society right now, right? And it's a place where, ideally, right, hypothetically, no matter who you are, you walk through the doors of a public school and you are accepted. You are in a space where you are mixing with people of different races, different classes, different backgrounds, who speak different languages, but you're all in the same place and you're all guaranteed access to the same opportunity in theory, right? We know in practice that doesn't always happen. We don't aspire to those goals, but I think we have to keep working towards those goals, right? If we can't say, if you're a child in this country that you have access to a high quality public education, then we aren't fulfilling our commitment to maintaining a democratic society. So one of the most important things that happens in public education, and people talk about the goals of public education, right? Where of course we're preparing students for the workforce, we're preparing students to be responsible citizens, but one of the really important things that I think we do in public education that we don't always talk about is that we're preparing students to be decent human beings, right? We want students to be in spaces where they have to practice learning how to do things like share time and resources, to get along with other individuals, to build community in spaces where the other people in that community aren't pre-selected in advance. And right, making decent people and human beings who can coexist in our society, super important, right? We need that in order to get all the other things that we want out of a democracy.
I would share so much of what you just said, those perspectives. I think I grew up in a home where my parents both really preached how important school was and how important respecting our teachers was. And just the value of that. And I think, you pull back and you look historically, that idea that for America to be competitive in the world, we need educated citizens, an educated workforce, people who are capable. And then you mentioned the kind of cornerstones of democracy. To be an informed voter, you've got to know how to gather information, think critically, all of that kind of stuff, and coexist with other people who don't always look like you, believe like you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I do think, too, that idea that, if you want to believe in the American dream, it is that any kid can be anything. Well, you need to give them that foothold. And I think that needs to exist regardless of who their parents are. And when you know how influential parental involvement is in education, okay, we need to make sure that the base level of this accounts for the kids who may not have those resources at home. And I think that's where, we can get into school choice in a little bit, but that's where the school choice, argument sometimes falls down. Is it's like, well, what if your parents aren't involved enough to make that choice? Should that kid not have access to a great education and the American dream as well? That 8-year-old's supposed to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. So I think that underpins my perspectives, which is why I'm so interested in your experience and what you've learned in the process. You talked about the accountability push, and on the surface, that sounds great. We want schools to be accountable for the outcomes, but where are the kind of hidden traps in an overemphasis on an accountability model when it comes to that being your driving educational philosophy?
Yeah, so our nation has kind of organized education around accountability policy really since beginning in the 1980s, and then institutionalized at the federal level with No Child Left Behind in 2001. And so we've got quite a bit of data to try to understand what impact accountability has on outcomes, but then also on the daily experience of school. Mm-hmm. And I think that we should right, expect certain outcomes from our schools, from our teachers, from our students, and we should be able to measure those outcomes and then make decisions based on whether those outcomes are being met or not. The problem is that when you attach incentives and sanctions to outcomes, you create a system that conditions behavior in ways that sometimes is pernicious. So the more, right, there's this, Campbell's law says that the more importance that you attach to certain quantitative measures, the more likely that those measures will be gamed, and the more likely that people's behavior will be twisted in ways that you don't want in order to meet those outcomes. And so that's, we've kind of seen a mix.
Let me paraphrase that for a second to make sure I understand what you're saying here. Basically, the more important you make hitting the target, hitting these goals, the more you incentivize people doing anything possible to maybe hit the goals at the expense of other things that might also be important.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, the idea behind accountability and standardized testing is to ensure that students achieve a minimum level of competency and that they're making growth every year, right? Like these are important goals. Of course, we should be doing both of those things. But the problem is that when the test determines what is happening in the classroom, anything that's not going to lead to more students achieving that minimum level of competency or showing growth is going to fall to the wayside, right? And just to give you an example of this, I was an English language arts teacher, and one of the things that we really want to make sure that our students can do is read, right? But what reading is, what literacy means, that means very different things if you're assessing reading from a standardized test where students are asked to read a short passage or an excerpt and then answer multiple choice questions. That's a very different type of reading than, say, engaging with a novel or a complex piece of nonfiction, creating your own opinions and an argument based on your reading, and then conveying that argument either in writing or in speech. A test does not assess your ability to do those things. As a result, I think of our intensification of accountability sanctions, we've seen a movement towards activities in the classroom that look like the test, right? Students are completing activities that look very much like the passages and questions that they're going to encounter on the test. And so an increasing number of schools and districts are abandoning the reading of whole books, right? Abandoning practices like writing, critical analysis essays or revising writing because the test doesn't engage students in this type of thinking. And over time, we've seen this focus also on certain types of students, right, in order to raise scores. So there's a longstanding practice in schools across the country, and this is well documented in the research, of educational triage is sort of the name that's given to it, right? Of hyper-focusing instruction on the students who are close to achieving a certain threshold, whether it's passing or otherwise, right? Focusing instruction resources there. And as a result of that, students who are maybe on the low end of performance, they're not getting very much because they're kind of abandoned as hopeless cases. And then students who are at the top are receiving even less because, well, they already get it. And right, as much as we say, right, we're focused on, growing all students, very often, right, there's this very narrow focus on getting those students who are on the bubble across the line. And that means that a lot of instruction is sort of targeted at the middle, and we're missing the support that students at the low end of achievement need and at the high end, right? That those kind of fall by the wayside as well.
I mean, I know anecdotally, I've heard from so many educators who complain about the amount of time they've got to spend on testing and all of that kind of stuff. And I get from, like I said before, the 10,000 foot view, while it sounds great in theory, but I think one of the biggest obstacles is that, like you said, how do you properly assess some of these things on a piece of paper versus what a kid actually knows, et cetera. But I think it's also tricky because causality when it comes to education is really, really hard to determine. I mean, we know a lot about correlation, that having involved parents correlates to good outcomes. Living in a wealthy, high-income zip code correlates to good outcomes. Teacher ratio correlates. But none of those things cause, or we haven't established a cause there. So you're trying to, it feels like you come up with this kind of educational soup that, checks as many boxes as possible and maybe ends up checking not enough of them at all.
Yeah. And I think part of the issue also is, a lot of times the creators of these standardized tests, are very clear that they're not designed to measure teacher quality, right? They're designed to give you a sense at an individual student level, what percentage of the questions that are asked did they answer correctly? But then we jump to all of these conclusions. For example, we make determinations about teacher quality, based on the performance of students within a class. We make decisions about school leader quality, school quality, district quality. And the creators of the tests are consistent in saying these tests are not designed to do those things, right? They tell us what this student knew and was able to do on that day. But all of these other extrapolations that we're making, the tests are not designed to do those things. And yet, because this is the water that we swim in, we've kind of just accepted it as normal. And I think, to go back to what you asked about before about the perhaps the unintended consequences, the result, I think, for a lot of educators and school leaders is the introduction of a lot of fear, right? Like there's a lot of concern that if your employment and your compensation and in some cases, the ability of your school or district to stay open or to be under democratic control is hinged upon student performance on these tests, then not only is there an incentive to focus instruction on the test, it's existential, right? You have to do it because otherwise you could lose your job.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the tricky things too is I did a piece recently on how much we expect out of public schools that they have no control over, or how much of the outcomes for a kid's education is influenced by factors a school can't touch. And I think the research that I've seen suggests it's about 80%, 70 to 80% of a kid's educational outcome is factors, again, outside the school's control. It's were they reading? Do they have good pre-K that help them get reading before they get to kindergarten? Are mom and dad involved? Again, we mentioned the high-income zip codes. Is that kid getting enough to eat? All of these other things that the school can't do anything about, and yet we're pointing at the school if a kid fails and saying, that's your fault. I mean, is that what your research has shown as well?
To some degree, yeah. I mean, there's a commonly repeated phrase in education that, right, zip code should not be destiny, right? That students, regardless of where they're from, should have opportunity to be successful. The problem is that we don't actually change that, right? And when I say we don't actually change that, I mean, there's a lot of factors that are linked to students' zip codes that are untouched by schools, right? So does a student have access to stable housing, food security, health care? Do their parents have stable employment? Are they earning a living wage? There's robust and research over decades that shows that all of these factors have a huge determinative impact on students' educational outcomes. Are there exceptions? Of course. I worked with many, many students who experienced so many of the ills of poverty in this country who, in spite of it all, came to school, worked hard, and were successful. But that's not the majority, right? That's not the rule. And I think that if we recognize that schools can't on their own fix or undo or cancel out all the effects of poverty, then that compels us to do a lot more than just address what's happening inside the classroom. I mean, that's important, right? Students should be receiving high quality instruction. Their schools should be staffed with experienced certified teachers, but we can't stop there and expect everything to magically be fixed, right? If our students are, bouncing around from home to home, they don't know where their next meal is going to come from. If our students are up, till 1, 2 in the morning because they're, working alongside their parents in some cases, or, working on their own to earn an income for their families, they're not going to come to school as prepared as their peers who have all those, sources of stability at home.
I think amidst all of this, we're here in Texas, a state that very proudly proclaims, independent control. The federal government doesn't boss us around. But when it comes down to individual school districts, the state has had no problem exerting quite a bit of control at the state level. You talked about the accountability. We have seen a number of high-profile takeovers in recent years. I'm here in Fort Worth, where the school district just got taken over. And I think one of my frustrations predating that goes back to what we just talked about, where you had a lot of loud voices in the city pointing fingers at the school and blaming the school for these outcomes. And again, schools need to provide the best resources they can, but not a single mention about food security, about infant mortality rates in the city, about some of the other aspects that affect those outcomes. And it feels like that's easy for public officials and education leaders to do, is to point those fingers instead of, because that's a lot easier to do than it is to fix the hard problems, it sounds like.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think, when you look at the work that's happening in public education right now, there have been efforts to try to bring those services into the school, right? A lot of districts have worked on, incorporating, community school models or positioning wraparound services inside of schools, locating, healthcare clinics, more social workers, more counselors, community partnerships on school campuses. Those programs have proven to be successful, but they are costly. And we are in a climate right now of austerity, and a lot of school districts are being forced to cut a lot of these really effective and successful programs because they're left with a school or district level budget that is, they can't, these are frills now, and these are proven essential services for student success.
But I guess the tricky part about that is, okay, so it's expensive, but the school district may be the one on the hook for that, but that money is going to get spent maybe someplace else if those services are provided. If it happens at the school, I would imagine it's a double benefit. One, you get the services provided to the family, which again helps the child. Also, you get that parent at the school. You get them in the hallways, interacting with the teacher. They see another kid. You build up the community so that there's a sense of pride, those intangible benefits as well, that makes people feel like, hey, we've got a good school here, and let's really commit to it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we know that from community school models, not only are like supportive in addressing families and students' essential needs, like you said, they increase family engagement, right? They bring families into the school building, which is what we need if we want to see student outcomes. I
also think, though, there's an ROI component to this. And I remember, and I'm going to forget his name, but a Nobel Prize-winning economist talked about the investment in early childhood education. The return was, for every dollar you spend, you might see $13 on the back end in terms of better educational outcomes. This kid has a lower likelihood of getting arrested and going to prison in his lifetime, which means you're not going to spend the money on incarceration. So the ROI seems to be there. That's just a hard argument to make, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah. And I think that sometimes there's, at least when we, again, to come back to the accountability system, there's a question about if in a environment of limited resources, there's pressure to put those resources into the classroom, which often means, right, are we paying for purchasing high quality curriculum or, in some cases, educational software and technology? Are we paying teachers? But I think we also need to recognize, right, there are these other really important investments that we can be making, particularly for our youngest children, even before some of them enter a public school, right, in their early years, to ensure that they are able to, access and engage with that material to benefit from instruction when they arrive.
I brought up the takeovers earlier. We, as I mentioned, have seen high-profile takeovers throughout the state. I am not a fan of them. I don't think the independent research I've seen says that they work. I think that they can really cause a lot of destruction and leave a wake behind. And it feels like it is a diminishing of public schools instead of helping them. What is your research, kind of top level, shown you about state takeovers, whether it's Texas or any place, really?
Yeah. So there is a pretty robust research base on state takeover, looking at not just what its outcomes are, and I'll talk about those in a moment, but also sort of what the process of takeover looks like and what all the consequences of that process are for teachers, students, parents, communities. So broadly, the research on the academic outcomes of takeover are uneven. Overall, we've seen, national quantitative analyses have determined that on balance, takeover does not improve student achievement, either in the short term or the long term. Now, that's a mixed bag, right? There are some cases of takeover where student achievement has risen, some where it's stayed flat, some where it has declined, and some where it's spiked and then come back down. So it's not a silver bullet for improvement. But we do know something about which districts tend to be targeted for takeover and what the consequences are for those communities. So overwhelmingly, I think more than 80% of takeovers have targeted districts that serve majority Black and Latinx districts. Like that's who gets targeted for takeovers. And often when those districts are targeted for takeover and their school boards are replaced, they're replaced by boards that reduce the descriptive representation of Black communities, right? So when a district gets taken over, their school board might have a representation on the board that looks like the community, and then after the takeover, it does not. We also see that there's downstream political effects of takeover, right? When communities lose the ability to A, vote for their school board, and B, run candidates for school board, the result is depressed political participation. So people vote less, they engage in the political process less because they're experiencing disempowerment. And then within schools, we also know a bit about how takeover and the associated mandates that come with it for what principals and teachers are expected to do. We do know a bit about what happens. So, looking nationally, takeover often results in the replacement or the turnover of large numbers of principals and teachers, often, triggers and declines in student enrollment. And it really shifts the focus of what's happening in schools, like we were mentioning before, away from this focus on the whole child and really on a narrow focus on meeting accountability measures.
Mm-hmm. That may or may not result in long-term impacts, as we kind of discussed. HISD takeover in Houston, the state has said they're doing so great, but we're not handing control back over yet, although their test scores are wonderful. But a lot of folks are saying maybe they're cooking the books. I mean, should we trust the claims of the state when it says, hey, look at what a great job we're doing?
Yeah, that's a really complex question. So I think it's important to recognize that when the state says, this is the improvement that we've shown, right? This is the number of DNF rated schools that existed before the takeover, and this is the number that exists after. It's important first to recognize that there have been significant changes to the state's accountability system in those years. So in 2023, when there were 120 something DNF rated schools across the states, districts across the state saw a drop in accountability ratings because of a shift in the thresholds that campuses needed to meet. In the years since the state has come in, there has not been an equivalent shift, which some people have referred to, as like a moving of the goalposts. Mm-hmm. I think it's also, concerning that when you look at, at a school by school level in Houston ISD, there are some unusual patterns in course enrollment that to me, raise some really concerning questions about what's driving these accountability rating shifts. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Eighth grade Algebra 1 enrollments in Houston ISD at the NES schools that are identified for the most aggressive form of state intervention. Algebra 1 enrollment in eighth grade at these middle schools has declined by 24% overall. At 9 of those middle schools, it dropped by more than 50%. And at 5 of them, it was eliminated entirely. And Algebra 1 as an eighth grade course, that's an advanced high school level course. So these previously, before the takeover, more students were accessing and earning high school credit than they are now. As a result, these students who in a typical year would be taking this advanced course are being pushed down into taking eighth grade on-level math. So essentially changing the pool of test takers who are sitting for that eighth grade test. Additionally, at the NES high schools, the number of students who are sitting for the biology end of course exam, that's the only high school science STAR test, has dropped by about 50% at the NES schools. And that's because ninth graders in HISD are no longer taking biology. They're instead being placed in a remedial science course like integrated physics and chemistry, or in some cases being placed in high school physics, which is very concerning because you really need a solid base in algebra to be able to understand physics. And now this is happening at the same time that the vast majority of ninth grade students in Texas take biology. So you're seeing this delay, right? Students are taking biology in 10th grade if they're sticking around that long at all. And so scores in biology are going up, but the number of test takers has dropped drastically at NES schools, and the students who are taking it, it's being delayed. And then finally, a part of accountability ratings for high school are determined not just by student performance on STAR tests, but also on schools' preparation of students for college, career, and military readiness. And there are a host of indicators that students can achieve in order to get a college, career, and military readiness point, right? Some of these include like certain performance on an SAT test or an AP exam, completion of like a dual credit course. But one of them that has existed up to this point is completion of a course called Texas College Bridge, which has since been discredited by the research. The research has actually shown that enrollment in this Texas College Bridge program actually has a net negative effect on students' college readiness, such that students who enrolled in this course ended up having worse college outcomes than students who completed no college, career, or military readiness requirements. But what HISD has done at these NES high schools is move about half of all juniors out of Algebra 2 into a remedial algebraic reasoning course that uses Texas College Bridge. And at the end of that course, students sit for a Texas Success Initiative exam, a TSI exam, which is supposed to indicate their college readiness. Even if students fail that TSI, they still get the CCMR points just by completing the course, which we know the course actually isn't effective. And the Texas Education Agency has issued new rules phasing out Texas College Bridge as a way of earning CCMR points going forward. But for now, that pathway is still in place. And the administration in Houston ISD is aware of this, and I think they're exploiting this loophole.
You and I have had a conversation before about this topic, and I think there were just so many takeaways, and none of them left me hopeful or optimistic because I feel like the takeover process here in Texas is described as almost like it's a last resort that the state seems to be chomping at the bit to take. It seems like, and for people who don't live here, basically, if you have a school that gets a failing grade 5 years in a row, one school in a district, the state can take over that entire district. You could have 99 schools getting an A and one school gets an F for 5 years in a row, and that is eligible now, that district for takeover. And it seems like the state is very quick to want to take that action.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I'll talk a bit about the Texas's state takeover policy, and then I can talk a bit about my research, which focuses on Houston in particular. So Texas has taken over more school districts than any other state in the country. And a majority of those takeovers have occurred in the last 10 years under our current governor and current commissioner of the Texas Education Agency.
And that's Greg Abbott as governor and Mike Morath is the head of the TEA.
Yes. And so when you look back at takeovers that occurred in Texas, and in many cases nationally, not every case, but takeovers that occurred before our current state leadership, a lot of those takeovers sort of pursued were based on a sort of conservative philosophy of education in the sense that they were designed to conserve public school districts. So the idea was takeover, like you said, was sort of a measure of last resort. The state came into a district that was dysfunctional district-wide, right? There were clear systemic issues where the district demonstrated a lack of capacity to lead. And so the idea of takeover was to come in and restore the district back to whatever state it was in before it fell into dysfunction, and then return it to local control. I think in the last 10 years, we've kind of seen a shift at the state level in how leaders view the purpose of takeover away from this more conservative philosophy and towards a more activist philosophy, where takeover is now sort of perceived as a vehicle for building what people in these takeover districts in Texas currently refer to as a new education system. So in that sense, the current round of takeovers that we're seeing, they're not just trying to conserve and restore school districts in order to return them back to local control. They're trying to use takeover as a way to build something different, right? So that when it returns to local control, if it returns, it looks very different than it did when the state intervened. And so my research is focused on the state takeover in Houston ISD, which started about 3 years ago. And that's very much what we've seen, right? The reform model that the superintendent has implemented is termed the new education system. And its purpose, right? The stated purpose that the superintendent appointed by the state has given is to transform the school district so that it serves as a blueprint for reforms across the state and perhaps nationwide.
The cynic would hear what you just said and think, if you take over enough of these big districts, then you don't have to take over the other ones because you have now set in motion plans that they will have to follow. Because let's say you take over Houston ISD and it's got I'm just going to make up a number. It's got a $2 billion a year budget in terms of money it gets from the state. You've now set it up so that, because so many high earning, relatively speaking, teachers have left, we've got less expensive teachers in, we've cut costs, et cetera, et cetera. We've sold off properties, we've cut headcount. We're now at $1 billion. So we're now going to make that the de facto standard for how we fund school districts in the state. And, eventually the smaller districts that haven't been taken over, they will have to make those changes too, just to survive.
Yeah, well, to step outside of takeover for a moment, our public schools in Texas are currently facing a financial crisis like they've never seen before. And it's a combination of factors that are driving it, right? Part of it is because of declining enrollment and a declining birth rate, but part of it also is because of the state's inability to adequately fund public education. We rank consistently in the bottom percentage. I think last count I saw was like 43 or 44 out of 50 in terms of our per pupil allocation for public education, right? And the state hasn't meaningfully increased funding for public education since 2019. We don't tie education funding at the state level to inflation, and we've seen quite a bit of inflation since 2019. We also fund schools based on attendance, not enrollment. So schools and districts that have more difficulty making sure students are getting to school are punished, right? And these are the students that need these resources the most. So as a result, school districts across the state are facing massive multi-million-dollar deficits and are cutting to the bone, right? Teachers, principals, core programs are being eliminated. The school district that I taught in, the college readiness program that I led, has been eliminated district-wide despite clear evidence of its success. And so when you're in this climate of fiscal austerity, I think there is sort of a good an incentive for state leaders to say, hey, look, we can do this on the cheap. Here's how.
Well, in the background of all this happening in Texas, which has a constitutional amendment prohibiting the state from ever having an income tax, state gets so much of its income from property taxes. There's been a push to eliminate property taxes at the state level. You're sitting at home, you read that, you might think, great, my property taxes are going to go down. And then you think, wait a second, how are we going to pay for school? Well, if the state has to pay less for school, there's your reduced property tax.
Yeah, that's right. The state has already set in motion a process to compress property taxes essentially to zero over the next 10 to 20 years, but they're now trying to accelerate it. And there's promises in the next legislative session in 2027 to just go ahead and eliminate the property tax. But we already, like you said, don't have an income tax. If we don't have a property tax, all that is left is a sales tax. And that's the most regressive form of taxation. If they eliminate property tax, I don't see any other way to fund the state budget other than increasing our sales tax. And then all it takes is one recession and our state budget would take a massive, massive hit. I mean, in 2011, the fallout from the Great Recession caused a huge across the board reduction in public education funding. And that was even when we had a property tax. And, so to go back to this idea about what does it take to fund public schools? If we don't have an income tax, we don't have a property tax, if we're dependent on sales tax, public education is the biggest line item in the state budget. We aren't going to have the money to continue funding schools at the level that they're at now.
I think that, behind that, again, the cynical view is that what we think are bugs of these state takeovers, that it drives families out of the district, that experienced teachers are leaving in droves, are actually features. Because a teacher who's been teaching for 18, 20, 25 years makes more than an unlicensed teacher off the street who you can hire, who's a first-year teacher, who just happens to be reading from a curriculum script that you have approved from the state level.
That's right. Yeah, the last numbers that I saw showed that in Houston ISD, where, this is the largest school district in the state, since the takeover, so before the takeover, about 1% to 2% of the district's teachers were uncertified. It's now somewhere between 20 and 25%, right? So these are people off the street without preparation, without training, without certification, like you said, who are being handed a script. I also saw recent numbers that indicated that almost half, so about 45% of the district's current teacher workforce has between 0 and 3 years of experience, which is a huge break from, the level of experience that we saw historically. And that's, I think, because of what you said, right? A lot of experienced, knowledgeable teachers have left HISD, have been replaced by less experienced and often uncertified replacements who are cheaper, right? You don't have to pay them as much. And that we know from the evidence, that the research, that uncertified teachers turn over at a much higher rate than certified teachers. And so we're kind of in this cycle now where every year new uncertified teachers are coming in, they're leaving and being replaced by more uncertified teachers.
As a parent who believes that my kids, all kids, deserve a great education, someone to be there at that school who cares for them, the idea that it's just going to be a different person year after year, theoretically, is pretty terrifying. There are people who'd say, well, then great. Well, then send your kid to private school, send him to a charter school, whatever. But again, the research I've seen doesn't indicate that on a kid-by-kid basis, that makes the difference in their educational outcome that I think we like to tell ourselves it does.
Yeah, that's right. On balance, we know that charter schools do not outperform public schools. We also know, to talk about a bit about our current policy climate in education, the state approved last year the largest state voucher program in the nation, which is set to go into effect this fall. We know from the research that vouchers have a net negative effect on student achievement. The evidence is so consistent on this, right? That when students take a voucher and leave their public school to attend a private school, the quality of the education that they receive is worse. And I think people are being sold this bill of goods, right? They're being told, hey, you're going to be able to attend these elite, high-performing private schools. And that's often not the case, right? People who take a voucher, there's no guarantee that the school is going to admit you. And so the schools that people are taking these vouchers and attending are often low quality. And so many folks who leave public education, public school system to attend a private school with a voucher often end up coming back to public education when they recognize that the quality of education that their child is receiving is not what they expected. But yeah, I think, we've seen an effort from state leaders to try to build all of these alternatives to public schools at the same time that expectations for what's happening in public education are intensifying. And so there's this intense pressure on public schools to do things a certain way. And then families are being told, hey, if you don't like it, go to a charter school, take a voucher, go to a private school. And it increases the appeal of those options, not because those options are better, but because they're sort of providing the safety valve, this opportunity for like an escape from an increasingly structured and regimented public school experience.
Well, and I think it's easy too. You attend a pretty charter school or maybe a nice private school and you think, look how great this school is. And it's like, yeah, your neighborhood school would be this great too if you all went there. If you all put the resources into that school that you're putting into the school over here. And you have a lot of private schools that are private because those families don't want their kids, if we're going to be honest, going to public schools and interacting with public school kids. And some of them will not accept the vouchers. So that idea that you can just take this money and go anyplace, I think, again, is false. I think one of the things I was most frustrated about during the debate about the vouchers here in Texas, state's giving $10,000 per family, which I believe is more than they are giving per public school student to the local school districts. I didn't hear a single statistical, factual argument. Hey, this is the outcome that we've seen. It was all about you should have choice. Meanwhile, you've got mountains of research on the other end showing that these programs get more and more expensive. They explode budgets. They underfund public schools because they're taking money away when that kid's enrollment leaves. But that school still has to keep the light on. It still has to pay the same number of teachers. It still has the same fixed costs. So now that, just on a per student basis, they're struggling because that cost went up per student. So it seems like every single factual statistical argument was against the vouchers. It's just that idea that we should just let the market reign supreme here, which I think is antithetical to the whole idea in public schools in the first place.
Yeah, I mean,
that's my soapbox.
Yeah, we've seen so much marketization, even within public school districts, right? A lot of those principles of choice and competition are now baked into public school districts themselves. Many school districts have now set up in-district charters or open enrollment choice programs, so that schools are expected to compete with one another, not just with the charter schools and private schools in their vicinity, but to compete with one another within a school district, which ultimately sets up a situation where you're going to have winners and losers. And if you're setting up a situation where you know that someone's going to lose, that is not a fair or equitable system.
Well, and I think too, the idea that, hey, public schools, you're struggling, so we're going to take resources away, get better, teach harder. I don't know what you're trying to ask those teachers to do that they are not doing already, because by and large, and I know people have some anecdotal experiences with, teachers that might not be great, but I think by and large, on balance, these are educational professionals dedicated to our kids who are getting hammered at every direction, it feels like.
Yeah, I mean, we should also mention, right, the state in very recent, months and years has intensified a climate of hostility towards teachers, to the point that they're now setting up, a whole office for investigating educator misconduct. And really, we've seen this cultural demonization of teachers really since the pretty soon after that they were hailed as heroes during the pandemic, right? And so you've got teachers who are sitting around saying, I'm not making as much money as somebody with equivalent level of education experience as I am. I'm being demonized in the press. I'm hearing state leaders calling me, a groomer. Why would I continue to subject myself to this? And I think, we've seen a huge departure of experienced professional educators. There's no pipeline in place to replace them. Right now in Texas, a majority of new teacher hires are uncertified, right? So the people who are coming into the profession lack certification. And even those who are certified, a majority of those who are certified are going through alternative certification programs, some of which don't even involve student teaching or like on-the-job training, right? They're completing modules online. So as a result, right, the vast majority of teachers who are coming into the classroom in Texas right now have not had experience instructing students in person, right? That this is a new thing to them. And so I think that increases the appeal of these models that are like out of the box, hand a teacher a curriculum and teach, because they don't have the base of professional knowledge that someone who's gone through a traditional educator preparation and certification program has.
I hear a lot of folks make the argument kind of underpinning this, maybe your kids have graduated or you never had kids, or why am I paying property taxes to pay for education I'm not benefiting from? It seems like that short-sighted perspective is pretty widespread, going back to that idea that we all benefit when we've got kids who are smart, doing well, who go on to serve our communities and, kind of raise the economic boat for everybody.
Yeah, kids become adults, right? They're going to be the firefighters who come to put out the flames in your house, or who see you at the doctor's office, or who are going to be the teachers of the next generation of kids. And so these, like you mentioned before, right, these early investments that we make in children's education, they pay off in ways that we don't track very well with tests, but they do pay off down the road when these students go out and become workers, become citizens, become, members of our society. And I think that if we don't invest in their education, we're setting ourselves up for a situation in the future where we're going to continue to have key gaps in the workforce. We're going to continue to have a population that's not engaging in the necessary critical thinking or participation in democracy that we need for a healthy society.
Well, the hard part about it too is these, you can demolish a school district pretty quickly, but it takes a long time to build it up, and it takes a long time to get a population educated. And you could be 20 years down the road and be like, why don't we have any doctors around here? Well, it's because we cut STEM education 20 years ago, and all the kids who wanted to be doctors went to a different state or went to a different county or whatever. So it feels like these are long-reaching. The decisions made now will have long-lasting effects, and I'm worried they won't be positive. But something you kind of said a minute ago, the idea of the costs and, eliminating this, a lot of people will point to technological advancements and AI as an education tool, and their eyes light up because they think, this is how we can educate kids. We can use AI and we can save all this money on teachers. But the research there is, I think, pretty worrisome too about how kids learn on a tablet or device versus how well they learn in the real world and what the efficacy of that education is.
Yeah, we don't know the consequences of educating students with AI, short term,
much less even on laptops or screens in general.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that we leap on technology often as a solution to address these problems, these longstanding problems in education, and each time we do so, the reality falls short of the promise. I think AI is particularly, concerning for a lot of reasons. I think first of all, we should recognize, right, like people are using AI across, sectors of our society already. And so there's this sort of like assumption that, well, if everybody else is using it, then students need to use it to prepare for the workforce. But how people are using it varies, and how students are being taught to use it varies. And, we've seen a lot of concern, I think, legitimate concern among educators who are seeing students who are offloading a lot of their thinking and work to AI, who are, handing in assignments and essays that are written wholly by AI, and they're not doing the necessary, work to think through these concepts, to develop their own perspective, to figure out what they actually think. They're just letting AI do the thinking for them. And I think that's going to, I think if we maintain that model, it's going to create some dependence, right? So that when these students graduate, enter the workforce, they're going to continue this process of offloading thinking to the AI and not engaging thinking themselves. But I think that what it's also going to do is undermine the professional knowledge that experienced educators bring, right? Like I as an educator, if I go into a classroom, I have decades of experience. I know, what my students need. I understand misconceptions. If we're integrating AI, we're letting the technology take the place of my professional knowledge and, teach students on my behalf. Students are not going to receive the professional knowledge that I've built up over my lifetime. They're just going to get whatever the AI gives them. And there's no guarantee that AI is going to tell them everything that they need to know.
Given the importance of a kid's education and that relationship, I'm just thinking about other relationships with kids. We would never want to let AI parent our children. We would never think about that. But if you view the role of education as being, underneath a similar umbrella, it's just hard to wrap your head around handing that off to a bunch of ones and zeros effectively. But an apparent potential proponent of that approach is the TEA commissioner, Mike Morath. And we haven't really talked much about him and his tenure. He's a guy who has said that he really cares about making sure, especially our disadvantaged communities in Texas, have as much educational opportunity as possible. But as a guy who does not have a background as an educator, it has been hard to take him at his word, especially when you have seen the educational outcomes in Texas under his watch. It has not been pretty. How would you assess the role of the job Mike Morath has done during his time as TEA commissioner?
Yeah, so Morath's experience in education is pretty limited. He served on the school board in Dallas for a few years. And then he was promoted to commissioner of the state's education agency from there. He's not a teacher. He was not in the classroom. He was not a school leader. He's not, conducted educational research. And so I think he comes at the state's education policy and the problems that are in it from a position of care and concern, right? He wants students to do better. But I think that because he lacks that direct experience in actually being an educator, he's easily swayed towards perspectives of other non-educators and people who have not had experience in the classroom, and is predisposed not to listen to those individuals who have that professional educational experience. It's easy for him to dismiss them. In his time as commissioner, which has now been about 10 years, we've seen, under the accountability system, a massive spike in the number of schools and districts that are being identified for accountability sanctions. We have not seen meaningful increases in support for public education financially at the state level. And we've seen a lot of frustration and strife at the district and school level as a result of accountability policies that his agency has implemented. And so, when you assess the tenure that he's had in this decade, that overlaps to some degree with my time in the classroom. Mm-hmm. You see this intensification of accountability, but at the same time, you see this shift towards, like we were talking about before, marketization and fiscal austerity that's kind of rigging the game, where it's becoming harder for public schools to do what they need to do. And that's kind of where we're at, right? The task still exists, but it is more difficult to do that now with the resources that we have than it was when he came on the job.
During his time, you've seen millions and millions and millions of dollars from outside the state of Texas flow in to support the election of politicians here that have pushed vouchers, that have pushed some of the accountability that seem to be, really anti the public education infrastructure here in Texas. Why would a Pennsylvania billionaire be involved in Texas's, statewide elections?
Yeah, that's a really important question, right? We saw the involvement of a lot of out-of-state money to support the governor and to unseat Republican legislators who were opposed to vouchers. They were, replaced by more friendly replacements. But when you think about why would somebody outside of Texas who has no stake necessarily in public education or in the private schools that students are going to be going to, I think it's important to note that, right, Texas has a really large economy, right? We have one of the largest economies, as a state. If we were a country, I think we'd be the 8th largest economy in the world. And I think that a lot of, out-of-state investors have a stake in businesses that are setting up shop and that are operating in the state of Texas. And if you want to ensure a return on your investment, you want to make sure that there is a business-friendly climate where those industries are not going to have to pay significant taxes to the state in order to operate. And to take us back to what we said before, right? The state has set us on a course towards the compression of property taxes. We already don't have an income tax. We already have very lax regulations for industry. But if we compress property taxes to zero, one of the major beneficiaries of that shift will be these large corporations that own a lot of property, that invest in a lot of property. Mm-hmm. And if we can maintain an education system on the cheap by eliminating property tax, because we can say, well, here's your voucher, go to the market, those out-of-state investors will see a benefit because the corporations and industries that they're investing in, their tax burden will be reduced.
So a little bit of context here. I've seen some numbers, and I don't have them at the tip of my fingers, but about Texas when it comes to road construction, highway construction specifically. And I think the state of Texas has built more toll roads, spent more money on toll roads in the past, I don't know, let's say 10 or 20 years than I think all the other states combined, something like that. And the idea being that, you're getting to save money on taxes, but you're paying for the toll roads. So it effectively, you're still spending the money, you're just not calling it a tax. And you're going to end up spending more when you're paying an outside company to come in, build the toll road, profit margin, the whole 9 yards. So this it feels like it's another one of those kinds of things, right? Like, we're going to cut the taxes down to zero. You're still going to pay for it. It's just not going to be in the form of taxes, and you're going to have this illusion of choice when you really don't.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good analogy, right? Like the original concept behind toll roads was the tolls would be used to pay the cost of the road. And then once the cost was paid off, there wouldn't be a toll. That's not the case, right? These are for-profit investments, the opportunities for corporations to come in and then continue to extract value from drivers. And I think you could look at, the voucher system in the same way, right? Like we should have a system where we are investing in students' education that pays for itself. But what we're seeing, right, is that students take a voucher, they go to a private school, there are a lot of hidden costs that they're going to continue to pay. And some of that cost is just the cost of tuition. Most, private schools charge tuition that exceeds the 10.5 value of the voucher. And so families are then taking on extra burdens and other additional hidden costs when they attend a private school with this voucher that they're being told is, hey, this is going to help reduce costs for you. And actually, what we've seen across the state is that a majority of applicants for the state's, Texas Education Freedom accounts were already enrolled in private schools, right? So these are families that are taking the voucher and are essentially using it as a coupon to knock down the cost of tuition rather than it serving as what lawmakers have promised it would be, which is a vehicle of opportunity.
Well, if we know anything about the free market as well, as soon as you start injecting 10 grand per family into the process, the cost of that, tuition will go up as well because those schools are not dumb and they're making a profit too. I want to be respectful of your time today. I know we're kind of near the end of our chat, but for a couple of big takeaways for people who are just looking at education in general, they're trying to pick a school. You see the school ratings. Oh, this school gets a B, this school gets an A, this school gets a C. What is your general opinion when it comes to school ratings?
Yeah, so the state's current system for rating schools is an A through F system. It was adopted in 2015 and went into effect in 2018. And what it does is it flattens performance across grade levels, content areas into a single letter grade, right? A through F. But then
you also have like grade schools and you have external ratings as well too.
Yeah, sure. There's lots of other systems that rate schools, but the state's rating system, I think, has a really powerful determinative effect on public perception of schools, right? Like families look and see there is an A-rated school here and a C-rated school here, so I'm going to go to the A-rated school. But the state's rating system is actually a little more variable and less concrete than people realize. So there are 3 different domains that the state uses to assess school performance in order to assign that letter grade. And it's variable which of those domains come into effect. So the first domain is overall achievement, right? What percentage of students are meeting or approaching grade level? The second domain is growth. So how much growth year over year are students showing for, how are 5th graders this year at the school comparing to 5th graders last year? And then the third domain is closing the gap. So is there a gap in performance between various student subgroups, racial, economic, whoever? The state, when it assigns an accountability rating, only selects from domain 1 or 2. They don't both come into effect. And so a domain 1 school that receives an A has maybe perhaps an overall a high percentage of students who are meeting or exceeding state standards. But a domain 2 school might be showing year over year growth, right? Like they may have, 5th graders this year performed at a higher level than 5th graders last year, but their overall achievement level may still be quite low, right? They may still, if you would substitute domain 1 for domain 2, they might have had an F instead of an A. And I think the problem is that the system it banks on this assumption that schools will always keep growing, right? That their growth will always continue, because as soon as a domain 2 school doesn't show growth, it shifts to being domain 1. And so you can see these rises and these falls back to a lower accountability rating, not necessarily because students are performing worse, but because they didn't maintain the level of year-over-year growth that we saw. And I think this, in the context of takeover, we see this, right, where the state has come in, put this intense pressure, created a culture of fear to drive up the ratings. We're seeing some year-over-year growth. Is that rate of growth going to be sustainable? It's an open question, because if it's not, and those schools shift back to domain 1, those A schools all of a sudden are going to be back to being F schools.
I mean, I think my frustration too is, let's talk about like a great schools rating. That's not rating parental involvement. And your C school might be pumping out national merit scholars. Your kid might do great. The A school, they may not. I just think it feels good to say we go to the A school, but who knows what your outcome's going to be. For people who want to find more information, where would you point them?
Yeah, great. That's a great question. More information on what?
Just the state of education in Texas in general, or wherever they may live. Any books that you would really enjoyed?
On the state of education in Texas?
Or in general is what, yeah.
I'm trying to think of something, contemporary work that's been done. I mean, if folks are interested in learning more about state takeover, and we're seeing a wave of them in Texas right now, Domingo Morel has a fantastic book called Takeover, Race, Education and Democracy in America. Fantastic. It's both a quantitative analysis of the effects of takeover, as well as a case study of two districts that underwent takeover, Newark, New Jersey, and Central Falls, Rhode Island. I think if you want more specific recommendations, I'm happy to recommend on certain topics, but there's so much that you can read.
No, well, I imagine a lot to process. I am so grateful for your time, your insight, your expertise. Dan, I wish you the best with your research and hope it makes a difference when it comes to the outcomes for Texas kids and their families moving forward. But again, a lot of hard work you've done, and I'm just so grateful you shared it with us today.
Thanks, and I appreciate you having me on. Yeah, I think a lot of people are really paying attention right now to what's happening in public education. And I talk to a lot of teachers, principals, parents, and students who share my concerns. I think families across the state, they want the same thing, right? Like they want stable public schools staffed by experienced, knowledgeable teachers who are going to greet their kids. And when they entrust their children with their care, they know that they're going to be in good hands. And all of this pressure and meddling and marketization, most parents, they don't want that. They want stability and predictability, and to ensure that their students are going to be under the care of an experienced and knowledgeable educator. So let's do that.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's, for those folks that are hearing this and agree with it, stand up and make your voice heard, because I think a lot of times it's been easy to stand on the sidelines or sit on the sidelines, but maybe it is time to stand up. Dan, that's right. Thank you again, sir.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for listening today. And please do me a favor. Don't forget to hit subscribe. Leave one of those 5-star reviews. They really help us out. And as always, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, on Amazon, on YouTube as well, wherever you find your podcasts. Have a great day.